Welcome everyone to this book club, film club short as part of this wonderful day put on by the Academy and the BOI charity. My name is Ella Whelan. I work with the Academy of Ideas on the Battle of Ideas Festival, and I'm a journalist and a commentator as well. I'm really delighted to be chairing today's session, D.W. Griffiths on D.W. Griffiths, The Birth of a Nation, which is funny. When we were putting this on, myself and Jeff, who is the CEO of the charity, were kind of talking about where we would find it. Before we started looking, we thought, is this film going to be publicly available? We sort of had an assumption that it wouldn't be because there's so much discussion about it being banned. Of course, I then found it on YouTube, so it was quite readily available. But there was that interesting thing that both me and Jeff were saying, oh no, well, we better watch it on a private browser window, or, you know, kind of the nervousness about watching it, which I'm sure our lecture day will talk about. But, you know, first, it's such an important film in many ways, despite the, or not despite the, but actually in essence of its extreme racist portrayal, both of Black people and the celebration of the Ku Klux Klan. The first ever, the first film to be shown at the White House, a huge cinematic success, breaking precedent in the movies on so many different issues and techniques, and yet still 100 years later causes a huge amount of controversy by its existence, and has, as our lecturer will talk about, shifted in its meaning over time. I hope all of you have had a chance to watch it. As I said, it was available on YouTube. But I'm not going to talk about this because we have our expert lecturer here to do that. And I'll introduce him now. Kunle Olulode is a great friend of the Battle of Ideas Festival. I know him through and the BOI charity. He's actually Kunle Olulode MBE as of this year, awarded an honours in the Queen's birthday for his work in getting better opportunities and different policies to help the Black and ethnic minority community. And he himself pointed out that it came as a shock to him, seeing as he's caused groups in Downing Street to go into stunned silence by arguing for the scrapping of awards and the creation of new ones. So that's Kunle for you. He's the director of Voice for Change, which is an organisation which is an advocate for the Black and ethnic minority voluntary and community sector. And he deals with issues of policy around that, as well as being a co-opted member of the Commission on Race and Ethnic Disparities, where he attends meeting in relation to his work with the Windrush Commission. But outside of this, or perhaps related to this, Kunle is also has a long-standing interest in the arts. And he was the former creative director of the Anglo-Spanish arts group Rebop Productions. And perhaps most importantly for today's session, he is a total film buff and a long-time critic and historian of film. He was part of the South Banks BFI's African Odyssey program, which included a program that was called Black and Banned Season, which looked at censorship in Black film, which is obviously, you know, politically very relevant for today's discussion. And a man of many talents, he's also a fantastic DJ. And if we were in a different situation, or either pandemic, I would be calling on the phone, getting him to play us some tunes at our Christmas party. So Kunle is going to speak for about 15-20 minutes, give us an introductory lecture. And then we're going to open it out to a discussion, which I really hope will be very much in the spirit of a seminar. So as many questions and comments from you in the audience, and we'll go backwards and forward to Kunle. As I said, this is a smaller format, these sessions, so I really hope we get a good discussion going. So enough from me. Kunle, the floor is yours.
Hi. Good afternoon, everyone. It's great to see so many familiar faces and a few new ones too. Birth of a Nation. The film and subject matter that we're about to delve into is something that I've been slightly obsessed about over 20 years. I did a film festival for a campaign called Workers Against Racism way back in the early 90s. And one of the films that I wanted to screen was Birth of a Nation. At that time, I found that it wasn't easy to get hold of, and more problematic was actually the length of the film. Being 3 hours long, it wouldn't have exactly fitted into the format that I was trying to pull together. However, many years later, much years of research, I did get the opportunity to introduce the film during its 100th anniversary at the British Film Institute. And at that time, and even today, I would say that I'm still amazed and somewhat perplexed that this film, this black and white silent film, still holds an amazing level of power to provoke a reaction, both positive and negative, right up to the present day. A film that people hate to love, or as one writer put it in an article, the worst thing about this film is how good it is. And what makes it so good? I think Ella has already alluded to the question of technical innovation. But I think that whilst we can admire its technical advances, the major banner overlying this film is one, of course, of its relationship to its depictions of race, and in particular, race relations in America post the Civil War. In many ways, the echoes of the debate around this film can be seen very much this year in the discussion around Gone with the Wind. And I will come on to say some words on that towards the end of this introduction. Silent film legend Charlie Chaplin called Griffith the teacher of us all. President Woodrow Wilson endorsed the film as like writing history with lightning. My only regret is that it is all so terribly true. The policy of congressional leaders wrought a veritable overthrow of civilization in the South, in their determination to put the white South under the heel of the Black South. Woodrow Wilson, that quote is taken from, put that out, and then later rescinded it and said that it never came from him. But it gives you a tenor of the film's ability to both excite and polarize at that time. More recently, people like Scott Simmons, in his book on Griffith, has said it's difficult to find a work of 20th century popular art that has shifted so completely from one that reports to tell us, convinced and moved its original audiences, to one that now seems to fail audiences on every ethical, emotional, and perhaps even artistic level. So this film is not to be taken lightly in terms of both his historical significance and its importance to critics. In 2015, as I said, I got the opportunity to do the introduction to the film at the major screening of the film at the BFI at South Bank. To see it on a big screen with re-digitized imaging and the massive speakers in NFT1, you really do get an insight into what it must have been like for people seeing this film for the first time in 1915. If we look at the technical aspects of it, films up until that point had been made around about the 20-minute mark. This film ran, as I said earlier, for 3 hours. It was made for $100,000, an unprecedented sum of money in terms of filmmaking. And specifically, when it was launched in 1915, it packed out cinemas all over America. It was also shown abroad in over 200 territories between 1915 and 1931. It's estimated to have taken upwards of $18 million by 1931, and by the outbreak of the Second World War, it was estimated to have been seen by 200 million people worldwide. And yet there I was in 2015 expecting the Oscars or the Hollywood Screen Guild or some of the award ceremonies to actually acknowledge the film's existence. In fact, it was completely expunged from any recognition. And indeed, even academics and intellectuals in America downplayed it. The first major conference looking at the film actually was held by University College London. And I remember attending that and meeting all these academics from America who'd come over to the UK to have the discussion that clearly they couldn't have in America. Likewise, there were issues raised about screenings, private screenings of the film being attempted in places like Los Angeles in the early noughties, where theaters had been threatened with being firebombed if they screened the film. So for me, the controversy lingers, and I've talked to many film critics and writers who've explored the reasons why this is so. And I think as we'll go on to discuss, perhaps, it touches on many of the issues that are germane both to this conference and to the wider debates around race that are occurring today, both in terms of the arts and in politics. Conventional history points to the film's outstanding cinematography, its introduction of new camera techniques, particularly moving action shots, emotional close-ups, and split-level screen melodrama. But most importantly of all, it's the hugely effective landscape battle scenes, which, armed with the greater knowledge of techniques from Griffith's earlier work, where he honed his techniques in small film production companies like Bioscope, he was able to develop a whole range of techniques, which he then brought to this major project. The film itself, in terms of its story, is set in the period of the pre-Civil War, and it settles on a notion, really, that we look at it through the eyes of two families, one in the South, one from the North, who are brought into conflict by the outbreak of the Civil War. Essentially, without giving too much away, the subtext is basically the South didn't lose the war because it didn't fight hard enough, or because it didn't have the right moral values. Essentially, it was betrayed by the carpetbaggers and industrialists of the North. And the key aspect of the plot is really a question of looking at how the South wins the war on the screen. It may have lost the war in reality, but it's about a whole series of post-Civil War theories that are brought to the screen through a play initially developed by the Reverend Thomas Dixon, who was Griffith's partner in the enterprise of the film. Dixon had, in the early part of the 20th century, had drafted this play called The Klansman, on which the film is based, and a second play called The Leopard. And using storylines from both these plays, they constructed Birth of a Nation. The Reverend Thomas Dixon, an ardent white supremacist, and certainly somebody who was far-sighted enough to understand the value commercially of controversy, was probably the perfect, in many respects, ally of Griffith. The Klansman, when it appeared in Broadway initially, Thomas Dixon knew and was very conscious about its racial content and how it would go down. In fact, so cynical was Dixon that he actually paid Black people to demonstrate outside the theatre to ensure that the play got maximum publicity. And so the birth of modern media, and if you like, film, was developed through the knowledge combined between Griffith and Dixon. And certainly when they made Birth of a Nation, they had one eye on the box office. For the screen rights, I think they paid something like, I think Griffiths paid him something like $12,000. But in the aftermath of agreeing that contract, Griffiths could not pay Dixon, and so gave him 25% of the rights to the film, which, as it turned out, was probably a bad move on Griffiths' part, as of course the film went on, as I indicated, to make a huge amount of money. It went on to become, before the Second World War at least, probably the #1 box office smash. But having said that, the immediate reaction to the film when it came out, not surprisingly, was met with protests. And I think that it's important to look at the birth of the National Association for the Advancement of Coloured People alongside the development of this film. In fact, the association had come into existence in 1900, but its first national campaign of any type was actually aimed at Birth of a Nation. The way that the images of Black people were depicted in the film, the historical revisionism of the film, and the juxtaposition of the historical inaccuracies, along with the quite beautifully filmed and technically brilliant composition, again, meant that this film couldn't be taken simply as something that would be easy to protest against. Indeed, despite its national mobilization, the National Association of Coloured People eventually had to give up as the film continued to grow in terms of its audiences and the knowledge. And we should say here that it wasn't just in America that the film grew in terms of knowledge and popularity. Throughout, for example, the British colonial territories, the film was a huge smash. And as I said, over 200 million people worldwide actually saw the film. In terms of responses, beyond the protests that occurred in New York, Boston, Los Angeles, indirectly, as I say, enhancing the publicity of the film and its popularity, a more positive response came from embryonic Black filmmakers like Oscar Micheaux, like George Johnson and the Lincoln Film Company, who attempted to make their own films to refute Griffith's depiction of Black people as feral, lascivious, and lustful illiterates, drunk with power and indulging in legally sanctioned excess and wanton violence. The particular film of Oscar Micheaux, which also a silent film in 1919, the production of Within These Gates, which is been shown, I think, on Channel 4, was a direct rebuttal to the film. But in a sense, still doesn't really capture all of the kind of power of what Birth of a Nation's delivered. And I think most importantly, more contemporary critics of the film have gone further. Film historian Donald Bogle has essentially seen the film as giving us the full complement of Black film stereotypes, highlighted in a kind of classic interpretive history of Black representation in American cinema, which he explores on the screen the characterization of what he refers to as the Tom, the Coon, the tragic mulatto, the Mammy, and the Buck. The Buck being the character Gus, who in the film is the protagonist that attempts to woo the lead character, lead female character, and at one of the kind of pinnacle moments of the film is faced with the prospect of being raped by the Buck, Gus, and decides that rather than being raped, she will preserve the honor of the South and jumps to her death. It's one of the seminal scenes in the film. So I think Bogle's work in his book is interesting because it's obviously on a contemporary level was then taken up by a number of other protagonists who come after. Certainly, Robert Townsend in his film Hollywood Shuffle expands on those characterizations. And for those that are like me, film buffs will probably reference also Spike Lee's film Bamboozled, which again looks at the question of blackface and the depictions of black characters in Hollywood movie making.
Just a few minutes left, Kunle. Sorry, just a few minutes left.
Yeah, which brings me on to, I suppose, the contemporary discussion now that has happened around film censorship. Lee, earlier this year, in response to a discussion about the removal of another film, I can't remember its title, Gone with the Wind, sorry. In the discussion around that was asked how he felt about the film. And I think Lee's response, and as an individual, is quite interesting because when Lee saw Birth of a Nation and Gone with the Wind at film school in New York, he was very critical of the films. In fact, he went away having seen Birth of a Nation, disgusted by the racism in it, and went and filmed a 5-minute critique, which he made available to his fellow classmates. The principal of the film school was so outraged, they wanted to kick him out of the school. Lee, I think, understood fully that the idea of just looking at film uncritically and not being able to look at its context and the way that it's constructed was important for him. What he said was that when they showed the film when I was at NYU, they left out the fact that at the time the Klan was dormant, and this film brought life back to the Klan, which directly ended up killing black folks. But that was not taught. When you put stuff in historical context in 4th grade, we had a class trip. They reissued Gone with the Wind. Seeing Hattie McDaniel and Butterfly McQueen, myself and other classmates were cringing. Lee continues, but no one told us that you've got to talk about this stuff. I don't think it should be banned. That's just my opinion. So the question of the disavowing of Gone with the Wind and Birth of a Nation, I think similarly falls in line with the debate of tearing down statues. Should we erase a shameful part of history for the sake of being progressive? Should we disassociate ourselves with the past and pretend it never existed? In relation to the D.W. Griffiths Award, the Hollywood Screen Actors Guild, that award no longer exists. In fact, it's now just known as the Screenwriters Award. Griffith's name was removed. In terms of, as I've said, the 100th anniversary of the film, it was not marked in any way, in any significant film institution or association. And we are now at a point where it seems that we're going through another discussion, not just about Birth of a Nation, but its antecedents, such as Gone with the Wind, have now become the subject of discussions, censorships, and bans in their own right. So I think that the question for us is really about how we actually deal with the past and how we actually put things into context and address them without actually censoring them. How do we make younger audiences understand that banning things is not a solution to understanding them? And not everybody agrees with that, clearly. The curator of TCM, Turner Classic Movies, has gone through quite a lot of angst in relation to looking at some of these older films. Indeed, I'll just finish by giving you this quote from Professor Jacqueline Stewart, who runs the Silent Nights on Turner Classic Movies. And she says, day after day, I scrolled through posts decrying the killings of Ahmaud Arbery, Breonna Taylor, and George Floyd. For weeks, video after video showed the escalating protests against police brutality and the brutal treatment of protesters by police. It seems inappropriate to share shots glorifying Hollywood's golden age in this moment of mourning and mobilization. Moreover, the classic films we showcase on Turner Classic Movies have played a major role in perpetuating the racist beliefs that devalue Black lives and normalize the use of excessive force against Black people. And that, in many ways, that quotes about how the past has actually shaped the present is, I think, a really important area of debate and discussion for this weekend. And I'll leave it there. Thanks.
Thank you, Kunle. That was a really wonderful introductory lecture. Thank you very much. It's very difficult to clap on Zoom, but you imagine the virtual clapping. Now it's time for people to raise their hands virtually and put some questions or some comments to Kunle about this. But while people are thinking about raising their hands, I wondered if I could ask you a question, Kunle, which is that the remarkable thing about this, and you talked about the NAACP and the fact that this kind of the Birth of a Nation was a kind of catalyst for that movement. But if you look back at some of I was looking back at pictures of some of the protests, and the placards that people were holding who were protesting the film had stuff like, it said ban hate films from New York, ban hate films. It's very similar language to what's used today. And there was a kind of public hearing, I think was it in Boston, where both Griffiths and William Monroe Trotter, who was part of the, founded the NAACP with Du Bois, both went and both testified, and it got kind of, some of the more smutty bits got clipped out, and that was the only concession they gave. But the argument that Trotter was making and the NAACP was making was that, the central point that this film would inspire public disorder or violence. And the thing is, the point about the KKK being kind of dormant, and then there was this sort of resurgence in the early 1900s. While it's pretty easy, not easy, but it's easier to understand how that might seem like a mad thing today when we don't have the KKK. But I mean, in 1915, when, and the reality of what happened afterwards, as you said, that Lee said, I mean, it makes it more difficult to argue against censorship. So how has that kind of changed that tension? Because you watch it and you think, yes, this is a film, but it's also it's direct racist propaganda. It's like saying, get on the horse, put your bedsheet on and ride out with us. So how is that tension between those two different contexts? And then we'll take some things from the floor, but maybe you want to answer that, Kunle, and then while other people have time to put their hand up.
Yeah, I think you're right. We have to imagine what it's like for people who probably go to the cinema for the first time in their lives and are seeing moving images on a scale that's never been presented before. The emotional engagement also, I think if you've probably read the introductions of the opening night, people were stamping their feet at the end of the film and cheering. And, you know, there was real fear of disorder on the streets. I think that I looked actually at, and funnily enough, I looked at the same pictures that you looked at in terms of the protesters last night. But I also looked at things like data relating to lynchings. And it's interesting that the high point of lynchings in America is around about the 1890s, well before the film comes out. And that's really as a direct response to the question of Reconstruction. And I think one of the things that we don't look at enough in terms of, and study enough in terms of American contemporary history is that period of Reconstruction, what it meant. There are some really very strange kind of coincidences with the film. One, you know, it centers on Charleston, which happened to be the one part of America where the governance legislature was majority Black in the 19th century. And so the depictions of that grouping in the film is highly controversial and negative and completely racist. And there's no doubt about that. But the idea that the film itself was partly responsible, even Oscar Micheaux, who made Within These Gates as a response, made the point that in fact his response to the film was governed much more by the reaction of American troops returning home to the South after the First World War. And the idea of Black soldiers coming back home to their homesteads with weapons, actually, if you look at the period, there was a whole wave of riots and revolts across the South. And lynchings also were not restricted to the South, they also happened in the North. I looked at the data for 1883, and it's interesting to note that the majority of lynchings actually at that point were of white people. If you look at the trend going into the up to the 1930s, lynchings as in general were on a downward trend. There is a spike round about 1918, around the time of the film, but I think that's more to do with the issue of what was happening in American contemporary society around the First World War and the push for greater democratic rights for Black people. And as I say, the returning soldiers who were actually armed.
Okay, great, thanks, Kunle. Right, we've got some people now with their hands up, so let's go to Claire Fox first. Fire away, Claire.
Yeah, fantastic introduction, Kunle, thank you. And that answer also to Ella's question sort of feeds into what I was thinking about, because, you know, there's been a bit of a debate recently about The Crown. I'm not asking you, but, you know, it's kind of, is it fact, is it fiction? You know, how do you depict history? And I suppose it's just to kind of reflect when people see things and think they're history, if they're fictional, but then see them as fact, how you kind of deal with that in the kind of art sense, but also politically. Particularly when you feel that Birth of a Nation was very much, as has been alluded to, kind of, I mean, it's kind of got the foundational myth in its title, let alone anything else, which is trying to establish something as the fact. It's very much a kind of call to arms, but you've dealt with some of that. But anyway, if you can just kind of reflect a little on that. But it does feel more, despite its qualities as a film, it also feels more openly propagandistic. But then going on to what you were talking about in terms of Gone with the Wind, one of the things that I found difficult about that discussion recently was, obviously one can be, you know, just like with Birth of a Nation, you can be with a modern sensibility shocked at the depiction of Black people, even if in Gone with the Wind it's got that kind of patronizing, pat them on the head type niceness rather than kind of Klansman, you know, and that kind of racism. But it's obviously racist. But on the other hand, I would like to be able to just watch Gone with the Wind and enjoy it as a romance, a story of families and so on. And so my question really is, on the assumption that nobody would, I certainly am not talking about banning it. I also sometimes want to be able to watch films like this without constantly having to, you know, do a bit of critical race theory on myself and check what attitudes I've got to all the leading characters. You know what I mean? I don't want to just watch these films to historically learn about the period. I might want to watch them as art, or just for the storytelling or the acting or the technical genius or whatever it might be, but that's not allowed. And I found that the people who were agreeing with me that Gone with the Wind shouldn't be banned said, yes, it's important we have Gone with the Wind so we can understand the historic period. And I thought, I don't really want that, just feels too joyless to me. I might just want to kind of get carried away with the whole romance and sweep of it all. The human stories at the heart of it, but you're not allowed to do that. So any reflections on that would be potentially interesting for me.
Brilliant. Thanks, Claire. Yeah, I love Seven Wives for Seven Brothers and find myself singing the tune about the rape of the Sabin women and have to catch myself because it's such a good film. Okay, Carlton, let's head to you next.
Hi, Kunle, thanks very much for a really great introduction, and kind of really liked your response to Ella's point. You're kind of drawing on the complexity of that historical moment. I'm not sure whether this is a point, and I'm slightly wary of making it, because I think what I'm doing is kind of trying to rescue Griffiths a little bit, in the sense that I'd like to talk about his second film, Intolerance, which was 1916, which was a response to the criticisms that he received for Birth of the Nation, in the sense that he kind of felt he had nothing to respond to as such, but he kind of made this film, which in of its sense is another massive movie. It's about 3.5 hours long, and it's kind of different vignettes. And one of the vignettes is actually quite interesting, and I think it kind of speaks to the kind of complexity of the historical moment that you're talking about. Basically, it's a critique of capitalist society and how capitalism destroys the lives of ordinary people. And basically, it's a really, really good critique of the class war. So on the one hand, we have this kind of racist who makes this movie, you know, a kind of racist propaganda movie, but his next movie contains elements that I'm quite sympathetic to. So is there a case that we perhaps should rescue Griffith rather than demonize him in that sense?
Brilliant. Thank you, Carlton. Now to David Cowlard.
Hi. Thanks, Kunle. It was a really good introduction, and it's really good to see all of these familiar faces from way back down here. Look, if I can ask a couple of questions. The first one is that what you're saying makes utter sense to us, but in the world where this is kind of dealt with, that, you know, the cultural turn is much further down the line in terms of anything that we're facing. So that kind of the response is generally that showing something like Gone with the Wind will just perpetuate the hurt and the emotionalism that is already in place, and that's quite a hard argument to be able to win when you're dealing with just emotions, and people are just kind of calling for it to be it's not worth seeing because of the hurt that it will show. So I guess in terms of all of that discussion around D.W. Griffiths, the use of tracking shots, close-ups from emotion, the battle scene, the kind of the argument against that is that it kind of just intellectualizes it and is drawing upon an old modernist form of criticism that isn't worth, it's just part and parcel of the problem. So that's, I guess the first question is how you deal with that. Second question is more just, you know, I think the people that may well be the ones that need to see it and need to talk about it are, you know, younger people, and possibly that there's an irrelevance that they see in the film. It's 3 hours long, it's black and white. And there's a kind of a point where, despite all of the facts that we can see, the moments where in film history there was quite a significant move made through the film and the techniques, a modern audience will look at it and feel it as it's kind of, you know, it's outdated, and if it's outdated but also therefore presenting something which is so emotionally against what they would want to align with, there's not much hope of them watching it. And I just don't know how you would get around that, really.
Okay, thank you, David. I'm just going to take Terry Murray, and then I'll come to you for some answers. So Terry, fire away when you're ready.
Hi, Ella, and thank you very much, Kunle, for the talk. So I've written these thoughts in the chat, but anyway, first thing I thought about was the fat oxen fallacy, this idea that he who drives fat oxen must himself be fat. You know, it's a mistake to think that every time you represent a certain thing, it's because you want to promote that thing. It may be that you want to show it, depict it, so that it can be studied, so that it can be critiqued, thought about. You know, a lot of art is disturbing and should be, because it makes us think. Secondly, Kunle pointed out how fertile the viewing of Birth of a Nation was for Spike Lee. He felt spurred by that to respond to it, and I think it probably inspired some of his best anti-racist work. Had he not seen it, he may not have, you know, been angry enough to have to think about these issues and to then want to respond to them. I know for myself, being a woman and a lesbian, growing up in a very Christian culture in the 70s and 80s, when the religious right were trying to shut down our rights, it was really, I'm grateful for being subjected to all kinds of sexism and homophobia. It made me think, and made me do some of my best writing. And finally, another last thought was, could it be that today's social justice warriors don't want an actual depiction of real racism to be seen, lest we then have something to measure their spurious claims of racism against?
Great, thank you, Terry. That's great. Kunle, anything you want to pick up on? Far away.
I think it's really interesting that people have referenced the film Intolerance. You're right that Griffith was particularly aggrieved at the treatment of the film by sections of the media, and wrote this film. But he also, Carlton, wrote a pamphlet to accompany it. And I think if you go on one of the, I think it might be the Smithsonian, you can actually download the recording of the content of the pamphlet. And I have to say that in relation to its content, and I've listened to it, he makes a number of points that are completely consistent with anti-censorship campaigners today. I think that the interesting thing also about Griffith, and again, it doesn't get discussed much by contemporary critics, is that in 1919, along with Charlie Chaplin and Mary Pickford and Douglas Fairbanks Jr., he forms the United Artists production company. Now, for those of you who don't know United Artists, it is the foremost independent filmmaking production unit. And many of the classic films of the 20th and even 21st century can trace their lineage to a United Artists. So from Chaplin's Modern Times to Rebecca, to Stagecoach, right through to the notorious money loser Heaven's Gate. And I suppose one of my fascinations with the film is, how do you go from making one of the most racist films in history to making something like Heaven's Gate? It's quite an amazing journey. Griffiths, as I said, was by that time, I think at the time of Heaven's Gate, hadn't been part of the company. I think he left somewhere in the 1940s. But the point is that people have, it seems to me, forget that we're not talking about politics here. We're talking about artistic production. And I think that links in with Claire's point, which is that, you know, we should be able to just look at something within its own context and confines and determine whether or not we see the, you know, the artistic pleasure in it and receive it in its own terms. I sat and took my daughter, funnily enough, who was at that time, I think she was about 19, 20, to see Birth of a Nation at South Bank. And you're right, I think a lot of it she found fairly tame and couldn't quite understand what all the fuss was about. But you know, the point is that we need to also educate, I think, critics and film audiences about what actually art is. It seems that people have confused art with political statements, and the rules that govern them are not the same. We have this, as was mentioned, I'm part of African Odyssey. We show films from the 1960s, the 50s, and the 70s. Quite often, content is sexist, racist, and we have to have the debates and discussions about putting those things into context. If you take, you know, a group like The Last Poets and the use of the word faggot, which predominates throughout films in the 1970s, right up to the 80s, you know, you're going to have to actually take those things on board. We cannot revise the past and pretend that it didn't happen. And I think, you know, that's kind of my key message on that point.
Okay. Just quickly, can you then I'll come back out to the audience?
Yeah, I'll leave it there. There's some other points I'd like to make.
Okay, yeah, I know that there's a few hands. I mean, I'm glad you mentioned Heaven's Gate. As it happens, that might have been a slump at the box office. It was the most important film for my family because I was named after Ella, the prostitute in it. So you're big fans in the Russell family. I've got James Woudhuysen first. So James, if you'd like to unmute yourself. And fire away.
Here we go. Yeah, is that all right?
Great.
Well, in 1970s, Andrew Sarris, who's widely regarded, or was then regarded as one of the great movie critics, began his entry in his classic book, The American Cinema. His entry on Griffith begins, "It is about time that D.W. Griffith was rescued from the false pedestal of an outmoded pioneer." And, you know, that's 50 years ago, and I think it's still true today. I think the question that he poses for us, apart from those on censorship and so on, and also the historical context of the work, is how do we deal with, and colleagues have referred to this, Claire and Kunle, with a film that didn't just pioneer the close-up and the crane shot and many, many other cinematic techniques, which is one of the reasons it got the audiences it did, because as colleagues have pointed out, they'd never seen anything like it. It was really innovative. And how do we reconcile that and some of the great passages in the film with the fact that it's racist through and through? And that's always been a problem for lefties, at least, because as Kunle was saying, they tend easily to disobey Trotsky and apply the same laws of politics to the realm of art. So it's very important to separate the methods one uses for each. And I bring to your attention, say, a modern movie like The Trial of the Chicago 7. That's a very good movie, suffused by liberal politics. I like it. So we've got to get used to the fact that some right-wing people write well, film well. The content may be distasteful, but the aesthetic and so on, and the techniques pioneered, and the acting and the emotions are terrific. How do we reconcile those things? Now, there's no universal answer. It depends on the movie and the times and all of that. But I think that point really needs to be brought out. Now, I'm not just inventing it about Griffiths being great. He's in the Pantheon section, the Pantheon directors section of Saris. But I don't know whether you mentioned this, Kunle. Lenin was so impressed with intolerance. For the one naive moment in his life, he invited Griffiths to take over Soviet film production in 1919. Griffiths declined, and Lenin was a bit sort of taken aback that he was only in favor of the brotherhood of man and wasn't a revolutionary. So that was one down for Lenin. But who knows what would have happened if such a guy had, taken over film production in the Soviet Union. So we need to recognize that his innovations were what made Lenin make the first major political pronouncement on the cinema, saying it was the most revolutionary medium known to mankind, something like that. So that balance between the aesthetics and the politics seems to me very relevant, and we're going to face it again when a new good right-wing movie comes out.
Brilliant. Thank you, James. Right. Okay. Wendy Earle. Fire away, Wendy.
Okay. Yes. Thanks. That was really interesting. And I was sort of yes. I guess kind of the questions of art and truth making come into this. And I was sort of, one of the things, I mean, I'm involved in quite a lot of discussions about art and aesthetics and the connection between aesthetics and truth-telling. And if you look at Birth of a Nation, you could say that it doesn't tell the truth in a sort of historic sense. It might have told the truth as Griffith saw it at the time, and that what he was trying to express was truth. But it doesn't tell the truth now as we see it, as we see the truth to be now. But I still think we can appreciate it as an artwork, because perhaps the truth that it tells for the time, in Griffith's sense, around sort of like promoting white supremacy, was actually only a very partial truth, and the film itself expresses something much bigger than that, which is the idea of fighting for your beliefs and fighting for the things that you think are true and morally right, and being prepared to make those kind of sacrifices. And maybe that's one of the reasons why it got such a huge global audience, because the particularities of white supremacy may have had a grip on popular consciousness globally at the time. I don't know. But I wonder if it did. But I think that more what would have got through in the film was that depiction of what it means to fight for what you believe in. And that, then is expressed through incredibly impressive new filmmaking techniques and new approaches to filmmaking, and stunning, really stunning photography and camera work, quite apart from the kind of the crane and shots and everything like that. So I think that's one aspect of it. And I think the other thing as well is to keep in mind in terms of discussing it as a work of art is that any great art does transcend its historical moment, and you can kind of see it as art for itself. If you look at a Caravaggio, for example, and the violence that is expressed in his work or the work of other artists in their depiction of the crucifixion of Christ and all of that kind of thing, the appeal of those works is sort of like goes beyond your belief in Christianity, or goes beyond the particular experience that Caravaggio might have been trying to get at when he made the painting. So I think it's the sort of, I think in a way, trying to understand Birth of the Nation in that kind of, big universal artistic tradition is something that's worth going into. And the idea of a sort of a deeper human truth being more than just what a propaganda piece might have been at the time. The fact that it transcends that propaganda perhaps is, a merit to its artistic qualities more than anything else.
Brilliant. Thanks very much, Wendy. Okay, Carlton, I'll take you next. And if anyone else wants to make a point or ask a question or say anything about what Kunle said or anyone else has, it's coming up to being around about your last chance to do that. So let's see some hands if you have them. Carlton, fire away.
Yeah, just kind of, Kunle, you kind of mentioned briefly in your introduction, the kind of how the Birth of a Nation established, I suppose, the stereotypes of the minstrel characters, the kind of blackface. It adopts some of those, but it also kind of solidifies those a bit. I just wondered if what you thought of just the kind of one of the things I've been looking at over the last couple of years, certainly it's kind of, particularly with the emergence of kind of black conservatism in the United States and the kind of their turn to Trump and their initial, I'm kind of reminded of Kanye West's kind of Make America Great, him coming out to support Donald Trump. And it almost seemed that the kind of the stereotypes of the blackface minstrel were deployed as a means to delegitimate West's position. So I just kind of wondered what you thought about that kind of the stereotypes that have been used to demonize black subjectivity are now used to still do exactly the same thing, but by and against kind of I suppose black artists or black forms of black agency that step outside of the expected norms of how blackness should perform and how blackness should behave. So I just wondered what you thought about the kind of the metaphor of blackface as being as relevant today as it probably was in Griffith's age as well.
Thank you, Carlton. Right, yeah, I've got just something to add, Kunle, and then I'll bring you back in. I mean, the interesting thing about blackface is that a lot of the time today, it's a crude point, but what's described as blackface or people talking about blackface, it's when you see it in the Birth of a Nation, when it really is the kind of the extreme performative version of blackface, with kind of, especially in relation to the character of the female mulatto, as she's referred to, who's kind of has these like raving mad eyes and keeps clawing at her chest, and it brings home how significant that is and what it's meant to depict, rather than you have instances of people, being, for example, Ariana Grande being told that she's doing blackface because she wears too much fake tan, which is obviously different to putting shoe polish on your face and looking like a lunatic. But the point I wanted to ask, Kunle, which was just a small one, was you mentioned in your speech that one of the interesting things about the Birth of a Nation is that it has, one of the ways in which it's changed is that the message of it, which was extremely impactful for certain sections of society in 1915, again, aside from a few lunatics, is kind of unanimously fails today. It's the whole propaganda of the film as a kind of as a thing with a purpose just completely fails, because if you, even as David was talking about young people watching it, a young person watching this would either kind of say, what is this kind of pantomime, or completely reject it. There is just no appeal to what's going on. And you'd be very, very unlikely to find cinemas full of people stamping their feet. So Claire asked about the fact of, can't we just watch films for the good of the film, which is a really important point. But is there something in, without kind of making everything into an educational resource, the impact of watching something, when I watched it, you just think, I can't believe that this actually took place. And it's not violent in terms of, you don't see people, don't see excessive amount of imagery of lynchings. It's not necessarily gory, but it's the subtlety of the message that is so shocking. And is there some, the difference in the fact that you've pointed out that it fails as a message that actually makes the message of it kind of even more impactful today? And we've got 10 minutes left, and I think the hands have run out, so just talk for as long as you want to now on anything that's been raised. Kunle, the floor is yours.
Yeah, I think Carlton's got a point about the issue of minstralism and blackface. It's interesting that seems to be much more a feature of contemporary discussions around race today than at any other time. There's this, for example, the black and white minstrel show that used to screen on UK TV. You look at it today and it's completely grotesque. But growing up as a kid in the 70s, being quite politically aware, I do not remember any group of black activists deciding to get together to run a massive campaign around the black and white minstrel show. And similarly, the stereotypes that Bogle refers to in his work, which believe me is well worth reading, even though you can see the arc of what he's getting at, those stereotypes that he's referring to, equally, it could be argued were established in an earlier era before motion pictures. In fact, vaudeville and the theatre space, I would argue that those notions were already established. But certainly in terms of the framework that Bogle builds, is quite compelling, but I think you can pick holes in it. In relation to where we're at now with the question of imagery, I think the whole kind of discussion around trigger warnings and the fact that HBO in the discussion around the removal of Gone with the Wind came back with this new format where films from the past that are difficult to consume are now going to have a kind of 5-minute introduction from various academic professors and critics in order to decide what the context is before you, the lowly individual, gets to see the film, does speak to, I think, something that, again, this conference is touching upon this weekend, which is the depiction of both the white working class as being in some way privileged and buying into white superiority, and a kind of black working class which is at risk and at threat from the wrong images being projected, which in turn reinforce their own psychological notion of themselves. And so, academia and the opinionated need to come to the rescue to put things in context, because, of course, ordinary people really can't understand the difference between fantasy and reality. The irony being, of course, that often reality is far more fantastical than anything people could put on screen. But we'll leave that for the time being. That's probably another discussion. But I do think, the idea of being able to look at things in their historical context and complexity has to be something that is taught, and we need. It's almost like we need to give young people the critical faculties to be able to actually have curiosity and probe deeper than the surface appearance of things, if they're to fully really understand them. I think that expectation has always been there, even with Griffith. People have talked about rescuing him. For Griffith came from a background in theatre. For him, a story was a story. Dixon gave his work to Griffith to produce inadvertently because of his pro-Confederate leanings. There's no doubt about that. His lineage points to that. But how seriously Griffith absorbed the notions of white supremacy and the defeat of the South and all of that kind of stuff. I'd question, at the end of the day, Griffith is an artist and he will work with the stories that he's given. And I think that he demonstrated the capacity to be able to transcend even his own beliefs, to work with material that didn't necessarily fit with his own political views. And will probably partly explain why Lenin thought he'd probably make a punt to get him into the Soviet Union. But you know, the film has echoes still that are relevant and contemporary. You know, Dylan Thomas, who went into the church in Charleston and laid waste to the Black parishioners, actually, by coincidence, was born in the same town as Griffith. And the church, of course, is in Charleston, where, of course, Birth of a Nation is set. And trust me, I had to give this lecture on the film on the weekend that shooting occurred, knowing what I knew about the relationship between Dylan Thomas's hometown and the relationship to this film. So yeah, even I sometimes, you know, have moments of real unease in terms of what this film has evoked and the relationship with racist attitudes. But I would say that, you know, we still need to hold on to a view that ordinary people can distinguish between the difference between reality and fantasy. But I think we're going back to a discussion about cause and effect and the way that artistic output actually inspires events in real life. Something that in the, you know, the 1970s even was being rejected. But there's something about this particular point in time where the great and the good obviously believe that they have the answers, and the ordinary people, if they're going to look at these areas of artistic output, need to be schooled in their worldview of why they should be either censored, rejected, or what the interpretation of the narrative is. So I think, you know, we're not out of the woods yet. There's much more to be said about this, but clearly it's not just going to be old works of art like Birth of a Nations, even newer, more contemporary pieces of work, whether it be in paintings, film, or indeed literature. I think at the moment, unfortunately, it's all up for grabs.
Thank you so much, Kunle, for that really wonderful session. I'll ask everyone to unmute themselves and join me in attempting to give you a real live round of applause. Thank you very much.